Camilla, I am reminded of the old African proverb. When the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. Will we all be trampled as China and America go to war over tariffs?
When Russia invaded Ukraine, I was one of those arguing that this is not the end of everything, it's the beginning of the reality post the Cold War. It's the new totalitarian state hierarchies that are now running us.
Shall we start talking about China? I've got to stop calling it that, but I can't. It's like one of those things now, isn't it, that you have to. So we've got China now accusing the US of economic bullying over their latest trade threat, and they have refused to withdraw their 34% counter-tariff against Trump. I will take your tariff and I will raise it and enforce it against you. That seems to be the card game being played out on the world stage. The American president has gone studs up during a press conference yesterday with Benjamin Netanyahu.
We lose billions of dollars. We lose close to $2 trillion a year on trade. We lose $1 trillion a year to China. We lose hundreds of billions of dollars a year on trade to China. We lose hundreds of billions of dollars overall, probably close to $2 trillion. When you look at China, when I took over, it was at $507 billion they were making. I call it making. A lot of people say, oh, it doesn't mean anything, having a surplus. It means a lot, in my opinion. It's almost like a profit or loss statement. And when I took over, it was $507 billion that China, this is originally, first term, and we were very, very tough on them because they were taking that money and they were building a military with it. Then when Biden came in, he let him get away with murder. He had no idea. I'll tell you what, that man had no idea what was happening, whether it was the border or China or anything else. He had no idea what was going on.
So what the president has suggested there, that could leave Chinese imports facing a staggering 104% border tax, so that everything that goes into America would be doubled in price if it came from China, which could obviously cause an inflation shock in America. Now, not just China that America is and the president is keeping his focus on. The European Union yesterday offered a 0 for 0 tariff deal. So said,
friendly.
We'll drop all our tariffs for you and you can drop all your tariffs for us. This was President Trump's pretty brisk response to that at the same press conference.
The EU has been very tough over the years. I always say it was formed to really do damage to the United States in trade. That's the reason it was formed. It was formed with all of the countries from Europe, I guess most of them, not all of them, but most of them. And they formed together to create a little bit of a monopoly situation, to create a unified force against the United States for trade. So they have NATO, which is largely the same countries, and they took advantage of us dollar-wise and militarily until I got there. I was able to get $600 billion from NATO, where they paid NATO because most of these nations weren't even paying. We were paying for NATO, so we're paying them to guard them militarily, and they're screwing us on trade. So that's not a good combination.
That's interesting, isn't it? When we were discussing with Tim Stanley yesterday, is this all part of a negotiation, the art of the deal? Clearly not, no.
Doesn't sound it for the moment. He is saying that this is the new world order that he needs to put in place. Peter Navarro is the senior counsel to the president. He also had a very similar role in President Trump's first presidency. And Peter Navarro is one of the hardest China hawks in the United States. It goes way back. He actually directed a film in 2012 called Death by China, which was all about how the growth of China as a world economic player was risked overthrowing the Western power structures that had existed for most of the 20th century. A decade before that, he had complained vociferously that China was allowed to join the World Trade Organization, which is the organization which polices global trade. Then, of course, Trump blamed China for COVID, a lot of what happened through COVID, which he then connected to his inability to win the 2020 election. So this feeling that is extant in America about China's risk to the way we all operate has been true in the United States for many, many years. It's not a new thing that Trump has suddenly bounded into. It's something that he's held dear for many, many years. And that is why probably the idea that this is simply a negotiating tactic is at this stage not holding water.
You forget about the pandemic, don't you? And the debate between whether it was a zoonotic disease that had escaped by accident from a wet market or whether it was a Wuhan lab leak. And we now know, because Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, had said that it was a lab leak from Wuhan, and he wasn't listened to at the time. And anyone that suggested that was effectively cancelled and told they were weird conspiracy theorists.
What's incredible is looking back at the difference in China's role in 2025. If you go back 60 years. So in 1960, the USA provided 69% of all funding for research and development, which is one of the most important economic drivers of growth. The rest of the world provided 31%, of which China was almost nothing at that stage. 2020, those numbers are almost completely reversed. Now the US provides 31% of research and development funding in the world. The rest of the world provides 69%, and the vast majority of that comes from China. China now outspends the USA on research and development. And America has moved from a position over the past 50, 60, 70 years of economic domination, which is why this debate is so serious, to a position of, although it is still by far the largest economy, the power of China to invest in countries abroad and to be the reason that they can still grow is now so powerful that this battle cannot be called for either side. If President Xi Jinping does double down and keeps the fight going, are we going to end up with a world which is US influenced and then a huge tariff barrier and then China influenced? And where does Europe and the UK go in that situation?
Well, with President Xi Jinping showing no signs of backing down, who will blink first? We've got the right man to discuss it in the Daily Tea studio. Sir Iain Duncan Smith, former Tory leader, the MP for Chingford and Woodford Green, and someone sanctioned by China.
Yes.
Proudly so.
Early on, yeah.
Very early on. An early hawk.
Like Peter Navarro, actually.
Indeed,
President
you just
Trump's
mentioned.
special counsel.
So, I mean, we've got quite a lot of breaking news right now, Sir Iain, because there's also the news we found Chinese soldiers on the front line fighting for Russia in Ukraine. We've obviously got the backdrop of this major tariff war playing out in front of us. What's your reaction? Well, first of all, to the Chinese soldiers. I mean, I know we knew this, but I don't think we ever had footage of them.
Well, we know. What do we know? We know for a fact. I just came back about 4 weeks ago from Ukraine, having been there a number of times. And we go onto the front line because we are a charity that was helping feed people on the front line. So we're in Kharkiv and all these other areas. So what did they tell me? They told me that China brokered the arrangement between Russia and North Korea. North Korea now supplies China. North Korea effectively supplies Russia with huge amounts of munitions. Now, there's a question mark as whether or not these are all produced in North Korea, but aren't somehow produced in China and shipped via North Korea for rebadging. But they're running at about 5 million 152 rounds, I think it is. We use 155 artillery shells, they use 152. And those have gone to them already in the last sort of 3 months. So they're one of the reasons why Russia is stabilizing and doing better in certain areas is they just outfire the Ukrainians because we've never produced that many rounds for them. We know that China almost certainly was producing small arms for Russia over a year ago. So it's very difficult to track the difference between the two. And we know that North Korea has put soldiers in the field, thousands of them, to support Russia. Actually, funnily enough, in the area around Kursk. So they were the main troops that were facing the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians say they're better troops than the Russians. But what happens is the Russians now, we are alarmingly told, burn the faces off and the hands off the North Koreans when they die, because they don't want them recognized as North Koreans. And nor does North Korea, for that matter. North Korea does not want wounded soldiers going back to North Korea. So if somebody's very badly wounded, what they end up doing is they have sort of kill squads going around getting rid of them. So, but the Russians do all this because they don't want you to believe that they're North Koreans. They carry out this nonsense of saying they're from Eastern Russia, but they're North Koreans that are fighting. So this is the nature of what happens. So If China has troops there, then they will not want to admit this, absolutely not. But they are vested in the success of Russia, because if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, then Taiwan is an open door for them. And the two are connected. I always say the road to Taiwan runs through Ukraine, because it proves that the West simply won't cope with any of this and splits and breaks up, which is what's happening over Ukraine today. So all of that is what we know. Are there Chinese troops? I would be not at all surprised if you found Chinese troops there. Whether they'll go down as volunteers or not is another matter altogether. But you know, anything to help Russia is what China is about at the moment. They want this war finished, but finished in favour of Russia.
So, Ian, we're going to talk about tariffs in a second, but actually, I want to ask you a question which flows from that. Shouldn't actually we be discussing sanctions on China, not actually whether we should be lowering tariffs for China?
I've argued for ages that China should be in the bracket of threatened sanctions and sanctions in due course. The problem is that we've avoided them. And they, of course, the reason why Russia is still going is because China arranges to buy all their oil and gas, and India is buying their oil and gas, refining it separately, but in the raw material they're buying it. So we know that is what's going on. So for China, there's a huge input straight away. And secondly, they are supportive of them in the Chinese fiscal system, financial system that's meant to replace the Western system. And they've already been allowed into that for China, who's built their own because they're worried about, getting locked out, etc., or getting dealt with or sanctioned. So all of that is going on. They are very close. He went to China first before he invaded to tell them that he was going to. China probably hummed and hawed a bit about the timing, but said, yes, if you do, we'll back you. Which is what they've done. They've made sure that the Security Council never votes against Russia, and they block anything that's likely to damage Russia's capability in all of that. And in the meantime, they trash every single WTO rule in global trade. So when Trump goes on about countries that have really trashed him, it's China that's trashed him biggest, because they use the central bank to fund bids from companies. Huawei and others have got big because they've been able to underbid every single commercial company in the world, which is why there's hardly any telecoms companies existing in that scale of things. That's why you've got them doing it on just about every imaginable thing you can think of. And so they trash the WTO. They also use slave labor in their products, which again is not just against the WTO rules, is actually a human rights abuse and a war crime. But they use that. In Xinjiang, polysilicon is used and made in Xinjiang under slave labor. There's millions of Uyghur now in slave labor. The women, by the way, are being forcibly sterilized, raped, brutalized. The little boys and girls are being taken away to re-education camps to become Han Chinese. I mean, the last time you heard all of this stuff was in the 1940s when you discovered the concentration camps and the death camps. This is what's going on in China at the moment. Everyone turns a blind eye to them, first of all because they're far away from us, and secondly because we've been so guilty about building up the Chinese economy through cheap trade. And, at some point we've got to stop letting businesses run our lives on this and actually go back to the idea that what is good for the UK and for other Western nations is that freedom prevails and that democracy exists and human rights exist. Without them, we are nothing. We are just pawns in the hands of powerful dictatorships.
So, Ian, are you saying that you're in favour of Trump's tariffs on China? What's your overall view of what the US president has been doing?
I think if we take a pace back, everyone's been railing, and I'm not a great supporter of Trump's in general terms, but the point I do take from this, and there have been one or two articles written about it, I think there was one in The Economist the other day that was saying, has he happened on the problem? And the problem is there. So what he's dealing with is the fact that open countries that practice free trade have actually basically lost most of their ability to manufacture or do things. Some will say it's because of the price and the costs. Others will say it's because of what the artificial cheapness of goods that are produced in places like China. So China's been the worst offender in all of this, which is why we've been devastated by the fact that China has taken pretty much every bit of industry. They're now about to take our last bit of the steel industry from us. How stupid was it to allow them in the first place? They said they want more money, but that money never goes into the upgrading of the furnaces. It goes back to China. They want to move, by the way, the company over to China, and they want us to take slab steel, which is their manufactured steel, which, by the way, is nothing like the high quality of steel that the UK produces, which is virgin steel, which is used for aircraft, tanks, etc. Oh. Aren't we about to try and get more of those?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we don't have a steel industry if you don't do something about it. So all of this stuff we've never looked at this strategically. We've said the free market's the free market. I had arguments with my colleagues about this. I said, the free market won't change anything. So no, it'll make them, China will eventually become democratic and abiders by rules because the free market acts as too important. I said, no, they won't. They'll trash the free market. And you'll say nothing about it because you're desperate for their trade.
Which colleagues are you talking about? David Cameron and George
It
Osborne?
wouldn't be a million miles away from the Chancellor at the time. But that was their argument. And my argument was, name me the one thing that underpins democracy and a free market. And what's the science? Well, it's all about vote. No, it's not. The number one rule that underpins our ability to trade with each other properly and within rules and to have a democracy is a thing called the right to own property. That is an English common law provision that came in the 11th century under the Bishop of Chartres. He was an Englishman, by the way. It's right at the heart of what makes English common law tick, because if you do not have the right to own your property, then you are basically in hoc to a government, any government. That means they can tell you to do what they want to. Your right to own property is critical to a practice of the free market. Because if you own your property, you cannot have governments take it away from you without proper due process and public votes. That's what we have here, and we take it for granted. They have it in the United States, and they have it now on the continent of Europe in most of the democratic states. And that is the background to habeas corpus and everything else. Now, this is what a free market looks like. None of that exists in China. But they're in the free market. Why? Because we want cheap goods, and we don't care how they make them. And we don't want to ask questions about it. Well, I think it's time we really ask questions about it.
So, Iain, do you imagine then, in a more positive scenario in the future, that there would be two great trading empires, one led by America, one would be led by China because it is such a huge global investor, and that there should be a very strong tariff wall between the two? Is that how the future, you believe, should look? And if it does look like that, which way should the UK lean? I can probably predict the answer to that.
Well, I'd like to take a pace back before exactly answering that question, because you've got to define really what this looks like. The truth is, we've already put up with the trashing of the free market. It's been going on for well over a decade and a half. We've been party to that. We've excused it. We've allowed it. We've said it's impossible to change. All the other countries too. America's been in that. We are almost one of the worst practitioners now, because at least America is asking questions. So this tariff stuff comes off the back of other stuff that even Biden was doing. For example, in America, they've now introduced a rule that says which overturns the burden of proof. They say to companies importing from places like China, we assume that you have slave labor in your product. You must prove that you do not have slave labor in your product. And they test it using companies called Oratane and others that use forensic science. They then sanction those companies if they're found to be lying about their supply chains. That has led to supply chain change in China, strangely enough, where they're having now to find ways to badge themselves with slave labor. We've done none of that. We refuse to do any of that. So first of all, try and change what you've got in front of you by the power of your own market, which we can do. There's no reason why you should accept that this would come down to an absolute division between the two. Don't put up with what China do. Make sure that when they do it, you blackball them for it, that you don't allow them to happen. That's where the West, the free market, should come together to say, we're not going to go buying goods, and companies will not be allowed to buy goods from China where they are abusing the rules and where they use inappropriate force, labor, all the rest of it. That is unacceptable, and we will now say no to them. Either they change or they'll get no change from us. And that's the reality. Now, we could do that tomorrow. Tariffs are his way, I think, of trying to say to China, that's what you're up to, And that's why you're sending goods to us at low prices, which we can't compete with. Well, the answer is now we have to price your goods at what the real price is. And if we do that, we may not need tariffs. So whilst I think he's identified an issue and a problem with the free market, it's not functional anymore, the idea that you can have a country the size of China trashing the rules around it and the WTO and then claiming the reason they don't have to obey the WTO is because they're a developing country. I mean, what in hell's name do we think that's all about? It's about undermining the free market. Stop it.
Completely take your point, and we had the Lord's amendment to the Great British Energy Bill where Conservatives, yourself included, tried to challenge Ed Miliband to say exactly that point. You must guarantee that any of the goods that you want to bring in from China to make your solar panels, to make your electric vehicles, to make your wind farms must not involve slave labour. And Labour wouldn't support it. So ironically, you have a situation where a Labour government is supporting actual modern-day slavery in China.
Well, just to say what Labour say to that, I mean, I take your point, Camilla. They say that in the procurement law already is provisions for being anti-slave labour. That's what they say. So just put that there.
Well,
I mean, let's not...
I can deal with that.
Very quickly,
very
because
quickly,
there's a bigger point here to be made. But go on
very
that.
Quickly, that is complete rubbish. I know they've said it, but we know for a fact that the procurement law cannot be invoked unless you've already had a case successfully mounted under the Modern Day Slavery Act, Article 54, I think, which says there should be no slavery. However, there is no provision in Article 54 to proceed against anybody. It has no teeth. So that means the Procurement Act cannot be used, which means, therefore, it's all hypothetical nonsense. What this would have done, and we supported it, and by the way, a lot of Labour MPs did not vote that day because they couldn't bear the idea of voting for slave labour on our product lines, and we have said this is voting for slave labour, unique for a country like the UK that is the inventor of human rights, that invented the free market, that we should allow ourselves simply per price. And let's be honest about it. Why? Because there's no way that Miliband is going to introduce his net zero program if he has to buy well-made products that do not have slave labour because they'll be too expensive. That's the reason. Money, money, money.
Okay, so on that point then, we need to re-industrialise pretty quickly, immediately, and at scale and pace. And can we do that?
The West has to do that now. And we should have been doing it 3 years ago. When Russia invaded Ukraine, I was one of those arguing that this is not the end of everything. It's the beginning of the reality post the Cold War. It's the new totalitarian state hierarchies that are now running us. And my question is, you either decide you don't mind, or you decide you're not going to do it. If you're not going to do it, the West has got to step up and decide that it can no longer just rush to China and places for artificially cheap goods. You've got to start bringing some of that make. And by the way, with all computer-aided design and manufacture, it's not the same as it was 30 years ago. You can do a lot of this stuff with the right investment that doesn't require incredibly cheap human labor.
And not Chinese investment, by the way.
Exactly, by the way. So my point is, and what do we do? We now worry about the threat. So we worry about the threat of Russia. China's a bigger threat than Russia is. So what we have is a strategic requirement to increase our defense spending. What the hell are they going to spend it on? Europe and the UK and America need to up their game on this. And that means strategic procurement of industry that comes back to the UK.
Cheaper goods, as you say, has been one of the reasons why we have cozied up to China. But also China has been a huge investor, not only in the UK, but in the US. I was looking at the figures this morning. China is the largest holder of US debt, $761 billion. The US relies on the comfort of foreign investors, of which China is one of the biggest. We would not only have to wean ourselves off cheaper goods and therefore have a dose of inflation, which maybe consumers should have to get used to via your argument, Syrian, but also we would have to get used to not having the investment that we have taken from China at pretty cheap rates.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about reversing the process.
How do you unwind $761 billion of debt investment?
Well,
China will not stand for it.
I think we have to take a pace back on this one too, because the truth is America alone can have that amount of debt because they are the global currency. So everybody will buy their debt. They never have a problem about it, which has made them lazy about this, by the way, because we would never get away with that level of debt at all, proportionately or anything else. And so it's a no-brainer for China to go in and buy that debt up because they get it reasonably cheap. So China, however, also manipulates its currency. One of the things that Trump has said is quite correct. They've been manipulating their currency, so they're able to do a lot of that. We still remain the single largest investor in the United States, and the United States is the largest investor in the UK. What does that tell you? It tells you that when people want to invest, they want to go to places where they think the rule of law is right. People are coming out of China right now. I've talked to God knows how many small and medium businesses who said they can't bear it in China any longer because they steal your IPs, they trash what you do, you get arrested, your companies get moved to somewhere else. They do it all the time, but bit by bit, we need to move some of that away. I see that Apple has moved their production of these iPhones to India because they were tired of what was going on and they don't want to be so located in one country. So there's lots that you can do prior to all of that about it. But America, and this is what Trump is, I guess, trying to do, to say to them, we can't live with this scale of debt. We've got to start making things again because that's the start of where your money comes from instead of constantly chasing around and borrowing money from other people. And most of the debt that America has now, if you examine it, is consumer debt. It didn't make anything. It all went for spending on goods and luxuries that they want, not on anything that's made or produced any longer. So that's what you have to try and reverse. Now, I don't think that the Trump view of life in terms of sanctions against various countries and tariffs will work, unless, of course, he makes it transactional. If it's transactional, then it's a passing phase to get people to change what they do. And if that works, that may change things. But all I would say for the UK and for the rest of Europe is we're way behind the curve, even behind America on this. So we need to sharpen up and we need to make sure that strategically there's a purpose to industry. It's to support here what you do so you don't end up in constant debt and beholden to countries that we wouldn't want to be beholden to.
I think we're concluding then, Sir Iain, that Trump must absolutely not blink and that we must go into this with matchsticks in our eyes.
Well, I would say that the UK has a peculiar position, not just because Brexit gives it the right to therefore talk separately about trade, but I think genuinely we are capable of getting a trade arrangement with the US. And the trick for the UK is that whatever else argues about who's in power, and let's forget for a second it's Trump or Biden or whatever, the one role the UK plays, which is critical for global stability, I really genuinely believe that. I'm not egging up at all the UK, but the role that we play is to hold on to the United States and make sure that they do their decision-making alongside us. It may seem like a peculiar ask, but it's the one time I know. The thing about the world is it's a safer place when the UK and the US are together than when they're divided apart. And you can go back through modern history and see whenever the US is alone without the UK, things don't go right. For us, it's important we stay with them and make sure Europe doesn't break from that tie. And that's the number one most important thing we do over the next 2 to 3 years. Otherwise, they will have won in the totalitarian states and we'll be running thereafter.
Sir Iain Duncan Smith, thank you very much indeed for sharing your wisdom and experience today on the Daily Tea.
Thank you.